Mark Twain Selected Works. The Private History of a Campaign That Failed. December 1885. You have heard from a great many people who did something in the war. Is it not fair and right that you listen a little moment to one who started out to do something in it but didn't? Thousands entered the war, got just a taste of it, and then stepped out again, permanently. These, by their very numbers, are respectable and therefore entitled to a sort of voice. Not a loud one, but a modest one. Not a boastful one, but an apologetic one. They ought not be allowed much space among better people. People who did something, I grant that. But they ought at least be allowed to state why they didn't do anything and also to explain the process by which they didn't do anything. Surely this kind of light must have some sort of value. Out west there was a good deal of confusion in men's minds during the first months of the great trouble, a good deal of unsettledness, of leaning first this way, then that, and then the other way. It was hard for us to get our bearings. I call to mind an example of this. I was piloting on the Mississippi when the news came that South Carolina had gone out of the Union on the 20th of December, 1860. My pilot mate was a New Yorker. He was strong for the Union. So was I. But he would not listen to me with any patience. My loyalty was smirched to his eye because my father had owned slaves. I said, in palliation of this dark fact, that I had heard my father say some years before he died that slavery was a great wrong, and he would free the solitary Negro he then owned if he could think it right to give away the property of the family when he was so straitened in means. My mate retorted that a mere impulse was nothing. Anyone could pretend to a good impulse, and went on decrying my unionism and libeling my ancestry. A month later, the secession atmosphere had considerably thickened on the lower Mississippi, and I became a rebel. So did he. We were together in New Orleans the 26th of January when Louisiana went out of the Union. He did his fair share of the rebel shouting, but was opposed to letting me do mine. He said I came a bad start of a father who had been willing to set slaves free. In the following summer, he was piloting a Union gunboat and shouting for the Union again, and I was in the Confederate Army. I held his note for some borrowed money. He was one of the most upright men I ever knew, but he repudiated that note without hesitation because I was a rebel and the son of a man who owned slaves. In that summer of 1861, the first wash of the wave of war broke upon the shores of Missouri. Our state was invaded by the Union forces. They took possession of St. Louis, Jefferson Barracks, and some other points. The governor, Caleb Jackson, issued his proclamation calling out 50,000 militia to repel the invader. I was visiting in the small town where my boyhood had been spent, Hannibal, Marion County. Several of us got together in a secret place by night and formed ourselves into a military company. One Tom Lyman, a young fellow of a good deal of spirit but of no military experience, was made captain. I was made second lieutenant. We had no first lieutenant. I do not know why it was so long ago. There were 15 of us. By the advice of an innocent connected with the organization, we called ourselves the Marion Rangers. I do not remember that anyone found fault with the name. I did not. I thought it sounded quite well. The young fellow who proposed this title was perhaps a fair sample of the kind of stuff we were made of. He was young, ignorant, good-natured, well-meaning, trivial, full of romance, and given to reading chivalric novels and singing forlorn love ditties. He had some pathetic little nickel-plated aristocratic instincts and detested his name, which was Dunlap. Detested it partly because it was nearly as common in that region as Smith, but mainly because it had a plebeian sound to his ears. So he tried to ennoble it by writing it in this way: D', capital U, N-L-A-P. That contented his eye, but left his ear unsatisfied, for people gave the new name the same old pronunciation, emphasis on the first end of it. He then did the bravest thing that can be imagined, a thing to make one shiver when one remembers how the world is given to resent and shams and affectations. He began to write his name so: D', capital U-N', capital L-A-P. And he waited patiently through the long storm of mud that was flung at his work of art, and he had his reward at last, for he lived to see that name accepted and the emphasis put where he wanted it put by people who had known him all his life, and to whom the tribe of Dunlaps had been as familiar as the rain and the sunshine for 40 years. So sure of victory at last is the courage that can wait. He said he had found by consulting some ancient French chronicles that the name was rightly and originally written Dunlap, and said that if it were translated into English, it would mean Peterson. Lap, Latin or Greek, he said, for stone or rock, same as the French Pierre, that is to say, Peter. D, of or from, a or one, hence the unlap, of or from a stone or a Peter, that is to say, one who is the son of a stone, the son of a Peter, Peter's son. Our militia company were not learned, and the explanation confused them, so they called him Peterson Dunlap. He proved useful to us in his way. He named our camps for us, and generally struck a name that was no slouch, as the boys said. That is one sample of us. Another was Ed Stevens, son of the town jeweler, trim-built, handsome, graceful, neat as a cat, bright, educated, but given over entirely to fun. There was nothing serious in life to him. As far as he was concerned, this military expedition of ours was simply a holiday. I should say about half of us looked upon it in much the same way, not consciously perhaps, but unconsciously. We did not think, we were not capable of it. As for myself, I was full of unreason and joy to be done with turning out of bed at midnight and 4 a.m, for a while grateful to have a change, new scenes, new occupations, a new interest. In my thoughts, that was as far as I went. I did not go into the details, as a rule one doesn't at 24. Another sample was Smith, the blacksmith's apprentice. This vast donkey had some pluck of a slow and sluggish nature, but a soft heart. At one time he would knock a horse down for some impropriety, and at another he would get homesick and cry. However, he had one ultimate credit to his account, which some of us hadn't. He stuck to the war and was killed in battle at last. Joe Bowers, another sample, was a huge, good-natured, flax-headed lubber, lazy, sentimental, full of harmless brag, a grumbler by nature, an experienced and industrious, ambitious, and often quite picturesque liar, and yet not a successful one, for he had no intelligent training but was allowed to come up just anyways. This life was serious enough to him and seldom satisfactory. But he was a good fellow anyway, and the boys all liked him. He was made orderly sergeant. Stevens was made corporal. These samples will answer, and they are quite fair ones. Well, this herd of cattle started for the war. What could you expect of them? They did as well as they knew how, but really, what was justly expected of them. Nothing, I should say, and that is what they did. We waited for a dark night, for caution and secrecy were necessary. Then toward midnight we stole in couples and from various directions to the Griggith place beyond town. From that place we set out together on foot. Hannibal lies at the extreme southeastern corner of Marion County on the Mississippi River. Our objective point was the hamlet of New London, 10 miles away in Rawls County. The first hour was all fun, all idle nonsense and laughter, but that could not be kept up. The steady drudging became like work. The play had somehow oozed out of it. The stillness of the woods and the somberness of the night began to throw a depressing influence over the spirits of the boys, and presently the talking died out, and each person shut himself up in his own thoughts. During the last half of the second hour, nobody said a word. Now we approached a log farmhouse where, according to reports, there was a guard of 5 Union soldiers. Lyman called a halt, and there in the deep gloom of the overhanging branches he began to whisper a plan of assault upon the house, which made the gloom more depressing than it was before. We realized with a cold suddenness that here was no jest. We were standing face to face with actual war. We were equal to the occasion. In our response there was no hesitation, no indecision. We said that if Lyman wanted to meddle with those soldiers, he could go ahead and do it. But if he waited for us to follow him, he would wait a long time. Lyman urged, pleaded, tried to shame us into it, but it had no effect. Our course was plain in our minds. Our minds were made up. We would flank the farmhouse, go out around. And that was what we did. We struck into the woods and entered upon a rough time, stumbling over roots, getting tangled in vines and torn by briars. At last we reached an open place in a safe region, and we sat down, blown and hot, to cool off and nurse our scratches and bruises. Lyman was annoyed, but the rest of us were cheerful. We had flanked the farmhouse. We had made our first military movement, and it was a success. We had nothing to fret about. We were feeling just the other way. Horseplay and laughing began again. The expedition had become a holiday frolic once more. Then we had 2 more hours of dull trudging and ultimate silence and depression. Then about dawn we straggled into New London, soiled, heel-blistered, fagged without little march, and all of us except Stevens in a sour and raspy humor and privately down on the war. We stacked our shabby old shotguns in Colonel Rawls' barn and then went in a body and breakfasted with that veteran of the Mexican War. Afterward, he took us to a distant meadow, and there, in the shade of a tree, we listened to an old-fashioned speech from him, full of gunpowder and glory, full of that adjective, piling, mixed metaphor, and windy declamation which was regarded as eloquence in that ancient time and region. And then he swore on a Bible to be faithful to the state of Missouri and drive all invaders from her soil, no matter whence they may come or under what flag they might march. This mixed us considerably, and we could not just make out what service we were involved in. But Colonel Rawls, the practiced politician and phrase juggler, was not similarly in doubt. He knew quite clearly he had invested us in the cause of the Southern Confederacy. He closed the solemnities by belting around me the sword which his neighbor, Colonel Brown, had worn at Buena Vista and Molina del Rey, and he accompanied this act with another impressive blast. Then we formed in line of battle and marched 4 hours to a shady and pleasant piece of woods on the border of a far-reaching expanse of a flowery prairie. It was an enchanting region for war, our kind of war. We pierced the forest about half a mile and took up a strong position with some low and rocky hills behind us and a purling, limpid creek in front. Straightway half the command was in swimming and the other half fishing. The ass with the French name gave the position a romantic title, but it was too long, so the boy shortened and simplified it to Camp Rawls.